Turn around, face the other way. Put your hands up.
When Rusk County deputies arrived at the property, they expected chaos. What they got was a 59-year-old man standing quietly in his driveway. No running, no crying, no weapon in his hand. He turned on command, raised both arms, and answered every question without hesitation. He told them where the gun was. He mentioned the dog, gentle as hell, he said, like a man giving directions to a guest. His son was dead in the hallway behind him. 20 minutes earlier, Scott O'Brien had dialed 911 himself. The dispatcher asked if his son was still breathing. Scott's reply, delivered in the same flat, unhurried tone he'd used to check the weather forecast, would be replayed in courtrooms and reviewed by investigators trying to understand what kind of man they were actually dealing with.
Hey, Scott O'Brien here. I just killed Jesse O'Brien.
You just what?
Killed him. Shot him in the hallway.
Sir,
That means he's deader than fuck.
He's deader than fucking. Not grief, not panic, not even anger. Just a fact, delivered like a fact. This is the story of what happened inside a Rusk County home on the night of April 9, 2021, and why the answer to one simple question made it one of the most psychologically complex cases the county had seen in years. Did Scott O'Brien act to survive, or did he finally do something he'd already decided to do? To understand that night, you have to understand the years that led to it. Scott and Jesse O'Brien shared a roof, father and son, 59 years old and 36 years old respectively, and by Scott's own account, the arrangement had become something closer to a siege than a household. Jesse, he would later tell detectives, had a drinking problem that transformed him, a man who could flip from functional to ferocious with little warning. Someone whose physical size, broad, muscular, formidable, turned his rages into something genuinely dangerous. Scott didn't just describe the tension, he showed investigators the evidence on his own face, a webbing of scar tissue across one cheek, the remnant of a prior altercation with Jesse that had reportedly left him with fractured facial bones. His skin had healed, the relationship apparently hadn't. What investigators were hearing was the portrait of a household where violence had already become normalized, where the question wasn't whether something serious would eventually happen, but when. April 9, 2021, was the when. But here's what made this case different from a straightforward domestic tragedy. It wasn't just that Scott O'Brien shot his son. It was everything that happened in the minutes before and after, the behavior that didn't fit, the details that didn't line up, and one small mechanical fact about a revolver that quietly became the most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Arrival of officers. Body camera footage from the responding deputies tells its own story. The scene they encountered was eerily controlled. Scott stood in the open, hands visible, making no attempt to flee or deflect. When officers moved to restrain him, he cooperated completely, offering his wrists, emptying his pockets without being asked, answering each question in sequence.
Anybody else in the house? No. Alright, why don't you walk back with me, okay, bud? Where's the weapon at?
On the counter.
Okay, walk over this side. Stand right here for me. I'm just gonna double lock these up so they don't tighten up on you. Nothing on you that I need to know about. Where's Jesse at?
In the hallway.
Okay, walk back to this car for me. Okay, stand right here for me. What do you have in your pockets?
I don't know. Money, probably.
Put everything here, okay?
Keys. I guess.
Well, I gotta check, alright? Put everything up here, alright?
Yeah.
Where are the dogs at?
She's upstairs. Hallway.
They're in the house.
I don't know where they are. It's his dog.
Okay.
She's gentle as hell, though.
Okay.
It was a bizarre detail, the kind of thing you'd mention to a house guest, not to officers processing you for a shooting, but it was also revealing. Scott O'Brien's mind in that moment was organized, functional, tracking multiple threads simultaneously. Inside, what deputies found in that hallway stopped them cold. The gunshot wound to Jesse's head was catastrophic. First responders arriving on scene couldn't make an immediate visual identification.
Ambulance 254, please respond to scene. Please respond to scene. It is secure. One patient, gunshot wound.
Paramedics went through their protocols because that is what training demands, but the outcome was already certain.
This is how we found him.
Okay, so you don't know how long?
We don't know how long. The call came in, what, 10 minutes, 15 minutes ago?
Hi, do you want to stop and keep all the emergency equipment?
We have an entrance wound. We have brain matter.
Jesse O'Brien was declared dead where he fell. The house was locked down. The .357 Magnum was recovered from the kitchen counter, exactly where Scott said it would be. And when one of the deputies leaned in close during the exterior processing, something else registered. The dense, heavy smell of alcohol coming off Scott. He wasn't just calm, he was drunk. Interrogation begins. In the interrogation that followed, Scott O'Brien did something that prosecutors almost never get handed so cleanly. He talked, at length, voluntarily, and with enough internal contradiction to give investigators exactly what they needed. His account of the evening went like this. Things between him and Jesse had escalated badly. Jesse had gotten a hold of him, physically, grabbed him by the throat, thrown him across the dining room, screamed threats about killing him and then going after other family members.
Talk to you and find out what the heck happened. So, can you tell me what happened tonight?
Just attacked me again
And who's he?
Jesse.
Jesse.
Is my son.
Jesse's your son? And what?
36-year-old son. Muscle bone, you know. And I just grabbed him by the neck, threw me in the dining room, you know, because he strangled me off and going, I'll kill you, motherfucker. And, you know, I don't know what his problem is, but, you know.
Scott said he may have blacked out briefly. He wasn't certain. What he was certain of were the words. The threats Jesse had made were recalled in precise, almost verbatim detail. The rage in his voice, the specific phrases, the intention Jesse had apparently communicated to destroy him.
Dope or whatever. I don't know what his issues are. But next thing I know, you know, then I figure it's over with. And he walks out, you know, out in the entryway, grabs a beer, walks out in the entryway, and I go, what the f is wrong with you, you know? And next thing I know, and I keep a piece in my cabinet there in case I got a home invasion or something, you know?
And when you say a piece, what do you mean?
Figured just a Magnum.
Okay.
Then, Jesse, according to Scott, had walked away, grabbed a beer, stepped outside for a moment, and Scott, rather than running, rather than locking a door, rather than calling 911 while his son was outside, stood up, straightened a chair that had been knocked over in the struggle, and waited. When Jesse came back through the door and advanced again, Scott moved to the cabinet, took out the revolver, and fired.
So he come charging at you, and did you already have the gun out of the cabinet, or?
It must have been one big stroke at the stroke of midnight. See, you know.
You lost me there.
Lost me too.
He described it as a knee-jerk reaction, pure survival instinct, a man who had finally run out of other options. Investigators listened, they nodded, and then they started pulling on the threads. Because here is where Scott's account began to develop holes. The same man who could recall Jesse's exact words, the specific threats, the tone, the intention, suddenly became uncertain the moment questions turned to the shooting itself.
So, you shot at him with the handgun?
Mm-hmm.
How many times did you shoot?
Yeah, once or twice.
Okay.
He wasn't sure. Where was Jesse standing when the bullet hit him? He couldn't say. What was Jesse doing in that precise moment? Moving, stationary, reaching for something? He didn't know. For investigators trained in behavioral analysis, this pattern carries a specific meaning. Genuine trauma can absolutely fragment memory, that's documented and well understood, but it tends to fragment indiscriminately. Scott's recall was surgical in exactly the wrong places.
Then came the detail that reframed everything. When the interviewing detective asked Scott to walk through the mechanics of the shooting, specifically how he had fired the weapon, Scott mentioned almost in passing that he had pulled the hammer back first.
Traumatizing, and it's happening fast.
Like I say, he's got the shit scared out of me, I don't know what he's gonna do.
And I don't know how you're... I'm not a big revolver guy, so I don't own one. Do you have to pull a hammer back, or?
I do, it's double action.
Sure, okay.
But
The detective paused. A .357 Magnum revolver in double-action mode fires with a single long trigger pull. It's built for fast, reactive use. Pulling the hammer back manually before firing converts it to single action. It dramatically reduces the trigger weight, shortens the mechanical sequence, and transforms the act of firing from reactive to precise.
So you pulled the hammer back, and do you remember how many times you fired?
twice.
It is not something you do by accident. It is not something you do in a blind panic. Pulling that hammer back requires a conscious decision, a moment, however brief, in which your brain has already moved past "should I shoot" and is now focused entirely on how. And what followed that deliberate preparation was not a wild, panicked shot fired into a dark hallway by a terrified, intoxicated man hoping for the best. It was a single bullet to the head, instantly fatal. A .357 Magnum round aimed with enough precision to kill with one shot, fired by someone who, by his own account, was drunk, physically shaken, possibly briefly unconscious, and acting on pure instinct. The question that hung in that interrogation room, and would later hang in a courtroom, was simple. How? The duality. To be fair to the full picture, Scott O'Brien was never a straightforward villain in that room. He grieved, or something that carried the shape of grief. He shook his head and said what no parent should ever have to say, that nobody wants to bury their own child. He reflected on Jesse's age, on 36 years of life that should have looked completely different. He talked about respect, about family, about how he had never treated his own father the way Jesse had treated him.
And did a bullet strike him?
I killed him deader than shit.
Where did it hit him?
Head sometime. I think he hit him in the head.
Okay. Where were you aiming at?
I don't even know.
Sure. Just at his body?
He wanted investigators to see him as a man who had been worn down to nothing, a father who absorbed years of documented violence and finally, on one terrible night, had nothing left to absorb it with. And here is the uncomfortable truth. That version of Scott O'Brien may not be entirely false. The scars on his face were real. The prior fractures were documented. The history of volatility that he described was, by all available accounts, a genuine feature of life in that house. But investigators aren't in the business of weighing suffering. They're in the business of evidence. And the evidence kept returning to the same place. The flatness of that 911 call, the composure on that driveway, the hammer that got pulled back, the shot that didn't miss. A man pushed to his absolute limit and a man who had already made a decision can look remarkably similar from the outside. The difference lives in a few seconds that only one person witnessed. Legal aftermath. Wisconsin prosecutors charged Scott O'Brien with homicide by intoxicated use of a firearm. The charge is specific, and the logic behind it matters. Wisconsin's self-defense statute is not a blanket protection. It requires that the belief in imminent harm be reasonable, and the law takes a clear position on what happens to reasonableness when a person is heavily intoxicated. Alcohol doesn't just affect a shooter's accuracy. Under the legal framework, it corrodes the very judgment required to assess whether lethal force was genuinely necessary. The state's argument, in essence, whatever Jesse O'Brien did or didn't do in that hallway, Scott O'Brien's intoxication made him legally responsible for the outcome of mixing a firearm with that impaired state. Because Scott had never denied pulling the trigger, the prosecution didn't need to prove identity. They needed to prove circumstance. And the circumstances were, at minimum, deeply unfavorable to a clean self-defense claim. No widely reported final verdict exists in the public record as of this account. The case of Scott and Jesse O'Brien remains legally an open question, suspended between a dead man's absence and a living man's story. Reflective close. There is no version of this story that ends well. Jesse O'Brien was 36 years old. Whatever damage had accumulated inside him, whatever the alcohol and the anger and the years had made of him that night, he was still a person, still a son, and he is gone, with no opportunity to answer for himself, to explain himself, or to become anything other than what he was in his final minutes. Scott O'Brien made a series of decisions on the night of April 9, 2021. Some of them may have been driven by genuine terror. Some of them, the hammer, the composure, the flat voice on that 911 call, are harder to explain with terror alone. What the body cam footage preserves is a man who either survived the worst night of his life or who had just ended a chapter he had been writing for a long time. The footage cannot tell you which one. Neither can this script. What it can tell you is this: the most dangerous situations documented on police body cameras are rarely the ones that happen in public, under streetlights with strangers involved. They happen in kitchens, in hallways, between people who know each other's names, who share a refrigerator, who have been sitting across from each other at the same table for years. The violence that builds in private is the violence that tends to finish in private. Rusk County, Wisconsin was quiet on night of April 9, 2021. Until it wasn't.